Okay.
Is it okay like that?
I'll just take that bottle of water out of the way in case it tips over.
Sellotape is less impressive as well. Yeah.
That one's mine.
COVID measure for your...
Thank you. So my research background is in understanding how respiratory viruses transmit from person to person, from host to host. And my current research focus is in developing novel ways of reducing respiratory virus transmission. So in Ireland, I think it's fair to say that up to this point, we haven't had much public discussion of airborne transmission of SARS-CoV-2. The discussion that we have had really has been led by Architect Assistant Professor Orla Hegarty and Professor of Atmospheric Chemistry John Wenger. And as SARS-CoV-2 has evolved over the past 2 years, so has our understanding of the dominant role that airborne transmission can play in poorly ventilated indoor spaces. SARS-CoV-2 has evolved and it continues to evolve so that now it's better adapted to infect us and can be more easily transmitted between us. Indoor spaces that are busy with lots of people coming and going, or that are crowded, or those with little movement of air, are high-risk spaces for airborne transmission. In these spaces, simply breathing puts us at risk of infection. When the air isn't being refreshed by clean air from outside, the virus can hang in the air for several hours. It can also be dispersed throughout the room. So if an infected person is in a poorly ventilated room, breathing, talking, shouting, without any interventions to reduce transmission, then potentially many people in that room can be exposed. Fortunately, we have several effective ways of reducing that transmission risk, such as vaccines, good quality face masks, and virus detection tests. But in addition, we could be using fresh air and ventilation much more effectively to reduce virus transmission. When we bring fresh air into the room, we dilute any virus that's hanging in the air, making it less likely for transmission and infection to occur. One of the greatest benefits of good ventilation is that once we've got it established for a given space, the benefits run in the background and the transmission risk is lowered sustainably without anyone in the room needing to do anything. So in its simplest form, ventilation simply means opening windows and doors so that fresh air can move across the indoor space, diluting and removing the virus in the air. But in the winter months, that gets harder. It's harder to balance the comfort of temperature with enough ventilation to reduce the risk. And it can also be difficult to judge what adequate ventilation actually is within a given space, in particular because it changes depending on how many people are in that space. So for me, this is where carbon dioxide monitors could be really, really useful. They don't measure virus, but they do measure how much carbon dioxide is in the air. And this indicates how much fresh air is in the room and how much of other people's breath we're breathing in. So it acts as a proxy for the virus transmission risk. Carbon dioxide monitors can be incredibly useful for identifying spaces that don't have enough fresh air. And I also think that they can be really reassuring, helping people to feel more comfortable and safer indoors. So this is important not just for consumers who have been encouraged to go elsewhere if they don't feel safe, but also for employees who really should be able to feel safe at work. For spaces that are difficult to ventilate adequately with open windows and doors, Hepa filters, like this one, or bigger versions, can be useful for removing the virus and cleaning the air. So depending on the situation, these can be small portable units like this, or buildings may require mechanical ventilation systems. We have the technology to monitor air quality and improve ventilation to make indoor air safer. Improving ventilation can require investment and specialist advice, but it's a long-lasting investment with many, many long-term benefits. Uncertainty has been a hallmark of this pandemic, No one alive has experienced a coronavirus pandemic, so we don't know how long our society and health systems will be under pressure from waves of SARS-CoV transmission. Investment now in sustainable ways to reduce transmission, such as monitoring and improving indoor air quality, is beneficial not just for controlling SARS-CoV-2 now, but will also pay dividends by reducing overall burden of respiratory disease transmission, helping to reduce the impact of new variants of SARS-CoV-2, winter flu, and future pandemic respiratory viruses.
Okay, thanks very much, Kim. We move the mics over then, and Paul Murphy will make his contribution. It's great to have Kim here, and thanks very much. And again, just to draw people's attention to a statement from Orla Hegarty that's contained in the press release there. So, Paul Murphy, TD.
Yeah, you grant. Yep. Okay, well, I think, all the scientific and technical arguments have been made extremely well. We're now incredibly almost 2 years into this pandemic. We are coming up on it. And it is the case that for the majority of that time, scientists have known that airborne transmission was central in terms of the spread of COVID. Whereas it's unfortunately the case that our public health messaging has lagged behind that, and most importantly, our legislation has lagged behind it. So despite these almost 2 years of a pandemic, whereby the vast majority of transmission has taken place indoors. For example, Orla Hegarty has spoken about just 400 buildings where a majority of the transmission that caused the deaths that we've seen in Ireland all took place in these 400 buildings. Despite that, we have had no legislation whatsoever giving workers, giving school children, giving people in public buildings and so on the right to access clean air. And this for us is absolutely central. I think that there's obviously no question that vaccines are a really crucial, central component of tackling COVID. But it's clear that vaccination alone is not sufficient. And so what we need is a vaccines plus strategy, a strategy of prevention, vaccination and control. And a crucial part of that prevention is understanding that just as, say, in response to cholera, there was like an understanding and awareness of the need for people to have access to clean water as a key way to fight cholera, is that a crucial way to fight the spread of COVID and to avoid the kind of doom loop cycle of lockdowns that people have been in is to ensure that people can be in indoor spaces in as safe a way as is possible, and that the way to achieve that is through proper ventilation and filtration where necessary. And that's precisely what our bill, the Workplace Ventilation COVID Bill 2021, sets out to do. So it does so by effectively creating this legal right of employees to clean air, with clean air being defined as having a CO2 level of less than 900 parts per million, or where that's not possible, appropriate filtration devices such as the Hepa filter or larger Hepa filters, as has been explained. It gives workers the right to call for inspections by the Health and Safety Authority, and in circumstances where those levels go over 900 parts per million, would give the Health and Safety Authority the right to issue a notice to say you've 24 hours to improve the situation, which in some cases may be as simple as ensuring you've got a window open on kind of both sides of the bar or restaurant or workplace or whatever. And in circumstances where you go over 1,500 parts per million, will then it would need to be immediately shut down until such time as the levels come down to a level that is safe. And they're the same levels that are in operation, for example, in Belgium, whereby it's the case that any pub or restaurant has to publicly display a CO2 monitor so people can see for themselves, is this a place that is safe? Is this a place that I want to be inside of? We are restricted, unfortunately, in Ireland in the legislation that you can bring forward from the opposition. You can't bring forward any legislation that would provide a cost on either the state or on any individuals. So what we think needs to go alongside with our legislation is to say precisely that all public buildings, including schools, every room, every classroom needs to have a Hepa filter as well as a CO2 monitor. The estimated cost of that is only 12 million euros. It's something we provided for in our budget. And we would also say that similarly, pubs, workplaces, restaurants, etc., also need to have CO2 monitors, so this can actually be monitored on a minute-by-minute basis. Again, I mean, we have CO2 monitor in our constituency office, in our office in the Dáil. These aren't expensive. It's like 75, 80 euros to get an appropriate monitor, and it means that you can see that, you know, are we reaching levels, heading towards the levels that are dangerous? Do we have, do we need to just open windows and so on? Like, these measures are very, very simple and would dramatically cut transmission. And there is an interesting paradox in that, like, correctly in the public health messaging, a big emphasis is placed on people being outside. But, like, there's a reason why it's much safer to be outside, and that's because the air is circulating freely and so on. And that same lesson then applies inside, is that if you have circumstances where people have to be inside, clearly school children, teachers have to be inside in school in the vast majority of circumstances. And clearly if, you know, pubs and restaurants are going to be inside in the winter months, clearly huge numbers of people are brought into workplaces. Well, then you have to kind of apply that through, which means let's make those indoor workplaces as safe as possible by ensuring that workers have the right to clean air. And the point I would also make is just to emphasise the point made by Dr. Roberts, which is that this is an immediate response to COVID, but actually has broader public health benefits. A bit like kind of clean water in response to cholera. Well, it's not just for cholera, it's good in general. Is that we already should have had this pre-COVID. It isn't just about COVID, it's about other respiratory illnesses, and it's about, I mean, people having the right to breathe good quality clean air while they're at work will be a more general health benefit to workers and society at large. So just to mention that we do have, and we're very happy to have the support of Sinn Féin, of the Social Democrats and the Labour Party. The bill, we already moved it obviously at first stage. We launched it in the summertime, and then in the first couple of weeks back of the Dáil, it moved at first stage. So it will be moved at second stage on Wednesday morning and will be voted in the evening of this Wednesday. Obviously we're hopeful that the government really should be supporting it. I don't know if they're going to oppose it. I have no idea what excuse they're going to come up with in terms of opposing it, but we need to see. But it would certainly be a question worth asking the government whether they have a position on it yet. Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Paul. So it's over to you. Do you have any questions, anybody? Tommy.
Two questions for people before Patrick, if that's okay, and then two questions for Professor Roberts, if that's okay.
That's okay.
How much is the Hepa filter, and if you're effectively, mandating workplaces and so on to have clean air, etc., do you think that these should be subsidised, and how much is that going to cost if you were a government? Then secondly, just a separate matter, government seems to have stepped back from the position on antigen testing and subsidising antigen testing. They've changed their position. Has people before profit changed theirs on that matter? And then Professor Roberts, if the Hepa filter is that good, would it be enough to keep the nightclub open, for example, because they're closed at the moment? And then just on a totally separate thing, if Omicron is found to be in Ireland, is it your view that we would need extra restrictions, and just can you explain why so?
Do you want to go first, Kim? Or?
Would you want to, given that the mics are here, will I just do it?
Oh yeah, sorry, I forget about the mics.
You're grand. Quickly, so I mean, that HEPA filter there cost us €80. That's a small HEPA filter which would be appropriate for like household use or a small office or 4 or 5 people, that kind of thing. For a larger room, you're talking about €200 to €300 for a HEPA filter. So they're not hugely expensive. The estimates have been done that to every school Every classroom in the country would cost about 12 million. To add to that, pubs and restaurants would cost about 50 million. So it isn't a huge amount of money. It's money that People for Profit budgeted for in our budget statement. And it is something that's been done elsewhere. For example, in Victoria, in Australia, Hepa filters have been installed in all classrooms. In Germany, money has been provided for schools to be able to get Hepa filters into classrooms. And we think, like, one, obviously, you're going to save lives, you're going to prevent disease, but even from a very narrow viewpoint of cents and euros, you're going to find it's a lot cheaper to provide Hepa filters than to have people entering into ICU care and so on, as well as losing work from being sick and so on. So we think there's no question it should be done. And yes, I was listening to the interview with Stephen Donnelly on the way in. So I note that the market has once again provided with low cost antigen tests, and now he's saying that it's such a success of the market that in fact they're not going to need to subsidise it at all. I mean, for me, what seems to be the obvious thing that's going to follow is, okay, those places where antigen tests are cheaper will very quickly run out of antigen tests, and then the usual price gouging will take place. So yeah, our position remains the same, that we should have free antigen testing. If you want to make it widely accessible, widely usable by people, it should be provided free through the public health system, as is done through the National Health Service in Britain. We pass these over.
Kim, if you want to. Thanks. This old Hepa filters in the way.
Okay, so the question was, would Hepa filters be enough to reopen nightclubs? I think it's really important to remember that we need to use a multi-layered approach to reduce virus transmission. So no one single intervention is enough to control transmission. We need to have a layered approach. So, this is why vaccines are so important. This is why masks, and good quality masks, I think, we haven't had enough conversation about what constitutes a good quality mask. And, if any mask is better than nothing, but if you're wearing a mask that is just a single layer or two layers of fabric that's loosely fitted on your face, it reduces your chance of breathing out virus into the room if you're infected, but it doesn't protect you from breathing in virus. You need to have something like these FFP2 masks if you want to protect yourself from virus in the air. And Hepa filters and increasing ventilation is that next extra layer that we really should be using to reduce transmission. And the expert group on ventilation was engaging with the testing of nightclubs and reopening of nightclubs, and was strongly recommending that that nightclubs look at their ventilation systems and make sure that there is a high rate of air change within the room. The problem, of course, with nightclubs is that it's inevitably a high-risk situation, because you've got masks off because people are drinking and dancing, and so that reduces one of those protective layers. And you can improve you can make rooms safer by improving ventilation, but it won't stop that close, what's the phrase, within coffee breath kind of distance of transmission. So it is all about layers and layers of intervention. Your other question was about Omicron and will we need more restrictions to control it? It will depend on whether or not Omicron turns out to be more transmissible than Delta. But of course, we're in a situation where we're struggling to control transmission of Delta now that we're in winter and we're indoors. So I think, from my perspective, it's about strengthening messaging so that people understand the importance of using as many layers of interventions as possible to try and reduce the transmission of Delta that we already have here, to increase the chance that we'll spot Omicron when it comes in, when it comes in. So I think that would be my advice.
Is that okay, Tommy? Yes. Any other questions there? No.
Just for Paul, in relation to, you stressed that the government's plan isn't sustainable, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that and tell us how this Vaccine Plus plan was going to improve it? And also, with the HSA, can you just elaborate on how the HSA will be empowered to act upon the workers' concerns or whatever, you know?
Yep. Yeah, so maybe start with the HSA. There's two aspects to it. So one, I mean, the Health and Safety Authority currently has the authority to conduct workplace inspections. It's just in general. It adds to the things that they can inspect, being also the question of CO2 levels in the air. So it means that the HSA then have the power to do that. The other thing that's introduced is that workers can request an inspection by the Health and Safety Authority into their workplace on the question of clean air. Obviously something is like posed by all of this, which is like, oh, do we have enough resources in the Health and Safety Authority to do this? You look at the slowness of the HSA in terms of dealing with the outbreaks in meat plants that we saw, it's almost probably a year and a half now that we first raised that issue in the Dáil. And the truth is that the Health and Safety Authority is currently massively under-resourced to do the jobs that it already has to do. Famously, it was Joe Higgins who pointed out that there was more dog inspectors in the state than there are Health and Safety Authority inspectors, which seems to remain the case. So as part of doing this properly, and again, it isn't something we can do with an opposition bill, but the Health and Safety Authority needs to be properly resourced. We also would make the case that there's a role for trade unions in this. There are countries, for example, Australia, whereby trade unions are able to take up the role of health place safety inspections, health and safety inspections. And we think trade unions should also be empowered to do that in terms of in Ireland. Yeah, in terms of the more general point, I mean, I think the government has made big mistakes that have gotten us to a crisis point that we've been at for the last number of weeks. If it's possible, obviously, in the worst case scenario, that Omicron is going to make the situation even worse. But kind of regardless of Omicron, we were in a crisis situation. How have we gotten here? One, which is an underlying issue, is that the investment has been put in terms of our health service. You read in the papers today about the extra ICU beds which were promised, which were hopefully going to come on stream at the end of this year, aren't actually going to come on stream until the end of next year, and which means our capacity to deal with surges is just less. Obviously, you don't want to reach a point that people are going into ICU from COVID or from anything else if you can avoid it, but that's kind of an underlying point. Secondly, I think the dropping of contact tracing in the schools was a very poor, quite disastrous decision. Obviously, the language has shifted now, where there's some acknowledgement that schools aren't an inherently safe place, which there was no scientific evidence for. You can read on which speak about the letters make, and the point that I thought is that, well, it's important as we agree with that. You don't do that by pretending that there's no transmission happening in schools. Instead, you acknowledge that and you say we're going to make a decision to try and keep them open, to ensure that there's filtration, ensure that there's ventilation, ensure there's CO2 monitors, to enable them to stay open. Sure, people will have seen the story of the woman who travelled here from South Africa and then has been unable to get a PCR test. And every evening there's people, it's like a Black Friday sale or something, where people are queuing up online at midnight to try and get the 10-minute window whereby tests open up, PCR tests open up. And then I think, again, underlying all of that is just ventilation has been absent from the conversation. It's been absent from the public health conversation. You can go into any pub or restaurant, maybe not any pub or restaurant, but lots of pubs and restaurants. And the people organising it are doing what they think they're doing their best. And they'll have a real emphasis on hand sanitising, and everything will be sanitised to the extreme, but often you won't find a single window open in those places. And it's because the messaging hasn't been there about this is a crucial thing, as well as the hand sanitising and so on, that needs to happen. And then the absence of law about this. I mean, I asked Leo Varadkar about this before the summer break in our committee. And is there any legislation about it? And he didn't really know whether there was legislation or there wasn't legislation, but there wasn't the whole time. We've been operating off the basis of guidelines in terms of ventilation. And it means that precisely when winter hit, people go back inside, there isn't sufficient emphasis on ventilation, is that then transmission begins to increase and then increases quite rapidly. So I think they've all contributed to the situation that we're currently in. Our bill, again, it's like part of a multi-layered response. It isn't a silver bullet by itself, of course, but we think if this bill passed, if it was quickly implemented, it would make a big difference in terms of bringing down transmission levels.
Yeah. Sorry, Chris.
Yeah, well, I have a question off Gail here for you, Bree, but we might do that.
Yeah, can we do that separately?
Yeah, but I just wanted to ask a question about this ventilation system, about costing. Have you costed how much it will cost the state to install this in all the schools, garda stations, public service, all those offices? And also for businesses, would you envisage that they would get some kind of subsidy, or that they'd have to bear the cost of this themselves?
Yeah, so the estimated cost for schools is 12 million. The estimated costs for schools, and then on top of that, pubs and restaurants and public spaces, is 50 million euros. And the way, I mean, again, it isn't contained in this bill because we can't propose the spending of money as an opposition party. But we would envisage that grants would be made available for small businesses and so on, to mean that small businesses don't have to shoulder the burden by themselves, but that it's a shared cost in terms of society as a whole, because we'll all benefit from it.
Is that okay, Tommy?
Just today we see the rolling out of antigen testing in school. Can I just ask if people before Packers welcome this move, and are you happy with the plan as it's currently set out?
I mean, I think it's better than nothing. But I think it isn't a substitute for full contact tracing. And I think there's a large element of which, like, it's being left in the hands of principals in the first place, and then in parents themselves to kind of follow up and do their own contact tracing, where we need proper centralised contact tracing taking place again in terms of schools.
Sorry, can I just come in there really quickly just on schools? Stephen Donnelly said this morning that there's been no conversations about the schools closing early, perhaps a week early, the week before Christmas. Do you think that we should be closing the schools a little bit earlier?
I mean, I think we should be doing everything possible to keep our schools safe, so that we don't have to close the schools, because the disruption that comes from closing the schools is immense. But I think it's a real shame that the government is not doing that. I mean, he was also asked about the Hepa filters, and his answer was, I understand what you're saying, I hear what you're saying, but the expert group tells us there's no role for Hepa filters, which I don't know why that's being said, and maybe you know more about it. It just doesn't seem to make any sense to me. There's no downside to Hepa filters,
It's not true, because Orla Hegarty tweeted the last day we had a conversation about this. I think I was on television or something, and she immediately tweeted with a quote from NEFIT recommending, not saying we recommend, but saying there is a role for HEPA filters. They play a very clear role in helping to keep the air clean, particularly in a school setting. And that's in print. So it is there that they, although they didn't say this is a key recommendation, they absolutely endorsed it.
When the expert group on ventilation had laid out the importance of ventilation and the potential role for CO2 monitors and HEPA filters in its reports in March and June.
So the government kind of denied that NEFIT ever said this was a good idea, or that what they say is they didn't recommend it, but they did say it's a good idea, it has a role to play, and they are in complete denial on it.
But you don't think we should be closing early for Christmas? Sorry.
I'm sorry?
You don't think we should be closing schools early for Christmas at this stage, no?
Well, you see, the problem is that the mess we have in schools is one that the government have created, and in particular Norma Foley's denial that there was a problem there, and the refusal to do contact tracing. I know a plethora of school teachers, people my age and younger, who are daily facing, the concern, the worry, the stress of knowing who's infected and who's not. And then there's 12,000 teachers out sick now because they've had symptoms. So our schools are being run down by the actions of the government. And if parents and teachers want to take a week off the summer to make the winter safer, then that's an option. But it's not, we have to acknowledge that we're in this position because of the policies of the department and their lack of action. Is that all right then?
Thanks all.
Thanks very much for coming on.
We can? With the filters.
Please, yeah, thanks.
With the